In previous episodes of this series, we've spoken about the remarkable variety in people's reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also argue that this variety is largely due to differences in our personalities, more particularly differences in our risk personalities. And risk personality is something that we can measure very reliably. The Risk Type Compass, a peer-reviewed psychometric measure of risk personality, places everybody within the 360-degree spectrum of a compass, which, for reference and interpretation purposes, has been divided into 8 segments, each labelled as a different risk type. The population as a whole is very evenly distributed within this 360-degree space. Any individual's position on the compass relates to the distinctive ways in which they each perceive, process, and react to risk, all of which is reflected in the decisions that they then make. Those with similar positions around the compass will respond to risk and make decisions in a similar way, while those further away from one another will react very differently, to the point where those at opposite poles of the compass will view each other's sort of take on life as quite implausible. They live in very different worlds and they're never quite going to see eye to eye. Viewing COVID experiences across the population using this risk type compass framework in terms of people's emotions and feelings on the one hand, and then on the other, the different ways of interpreting, understanding, and making sense of what's been going on during this drawn-out epidemic, we can see that different people have had very different COVID stories to tell. Now, in this final episode, we draw a horizontal line across the risk type compass from east to west, from the extreme deliberate risk type to the extreme excitable risk type, each facing the other from opposite ends of a continuum. At one end of the continuum is the excitable risk type. At the root of this risk type is a tension between boundless curiosity, enthusiasm for new and interesting ideas, combined with a propensity for potent feelings and concerns. At a general level, the excitable risk type is creative, expressive, and they react strongly to events. The spontaneity of sort of fast-paced, on-the-fly decisions will always appeal to the carefree side of their nature, but emotionally they're prone to anxiety and stress and a lurking suspicion that things may go wrong. This is a restless struggle to reconcile a desire for novelty and excitement with underlying apprehensions, and it will not always end well for the excitable risk types. At the opposite pole is the deliberate risk type. Now, at the foot of this risk type are high levels of composure and calm self-confidence, combined with detailed planning and preparation. They're very stable emotionally, and they're not easily aroused or knocked off course. They experience little anxiety, dealing with issues in a business-like, pragmatic, and unemotional way. Although they're not fearful of risk, they are deeply troubled by ambiguity or uncertainty. They'll be alert to any incoherence and will work hard to reduce or even eliminate it. This makes them very conscientious about developing and implementing effective routines, processes, and systems. The comparison of these two risk types and everything between them is particularly fascinating because there's an inherent tension throughout this continuum, a struggle at both ends between the heart and the mind, because each of them, albeit in their own way, is simultaneously risk-taking and, on the other hand, also risk-averse. As you'll see, the results, the outcomes of those tensions, are resolved very differently at each extreme. The main distinguishing factor between these two risk types is the extent to which they're consistent and predictable in their decision making. So, We'll start on the left-hand side of the risk type compass and turn our attention then to the excitable risk type. We consider what happens at this extreme end of the continuum, and within the excitable risk type personality, there is a constitutional conflict between the heart and mind. From an emotional point of view, the excitable risk type is risk averse, but from a cognitive point of view, they're risk taking. This is a tug of war between what they feel and what they think. Emotionally, the excitable risk type can be highly reactive. Their emotional risk antennae are highly sensitive. They scan people and situations rigorously, picking up on any indication of threat, danger, insecurity, or loss. Anything that might interfere with their hopes and plans, whether that be personally, socially, physically, or even economically. This side of their nature explains why they're likely to be cautious or questioning, and perhaps even pessimistic decision makers. A strong version of the excitable risk type is never quite free from the suspicion that whatever opportunities present themselves, deep down in their emotions, they have a gut feeling that something could always go wrong, that it might just be a disaster. But cognitively, the picture for the excitable risk type is very different. Their cognitive risk antennae are dialed down. In terms of their need to know, their exclusion criteria are quite relaxed. They're carefree, and this means that they're untroubled by uncertainty. In fact, they welcome it. They're excited by change and innovation. The excitable risk type location is the hotspot for inner conflict, the greatest tension in the entire 360-degree spectrum of the risk type compass. These people are curious and challenging, and they look for excitement, but the heart says no, like, be careful, come away, avoid that, while the head is saying, oh, but it looks so interesting, like I can see so many exciting possibilities. I'll come away, but in a minute, I want to just look a little bit closer, just for that little bit longer. This tug of war between fearful emotions and fearless cognitions make decision-making a precarious and potentially impulsive process. The tension and the adrenaline that it initiates may itself be a thrilling experience. Having to come down either on one side or the other would be an anticlimax and a disappointment. There's an addictive trap in all of this. Do I give up on the potential excitement and just walk away, settling for definite disappointment now? Or shall I hang on to the excitement but face an even bigger crunch if it does all go spectacularly wrong? And so, for the excitable risk type, this pendulum of decision-making swings back between the head and the heart. One example of how the excitable risk type manifests in the real world is among creative individuals. Take the example of improvisational comedians. They have to captivate and hold their audiences with their in-the-moment versatility. A stand-up comedian has to keep their options open to feel the audience reaction and then ride the wave, spotting opportunities to engage and respond instantaneously, making these lightning decisions on the fly. For the performance to be a real success, the audience needs to buy into this balancing act to fuel the excitement of the performance with their reaction to it. And so the performers live on the edge between success, applause and laughter that they crave, and the dark abyss of abject failure. If you've ever seen the likes of the late Robin Williams improvising, you'll have experienced this tension as it grasps audiences and keeps it on the edge of the seat. All creativity operates on the fringe of uncertainty, a territory that is familiar ground to the excitable risk type. On the opposite side of the compass, here also there is a constitutional conflict between heart and mind within the deliberate risk type personality. But the polarities have now been reversed. So From an emotional point of view, the deliberate risk type is risk-taking. But from a cognitive point of view, they're risk-averse. So there's still a tug of war between what people feel and what they think, but it's the opposite way around. Rather than mirroring the tensions of excitable risk types, this combination produces a calm, unemotional advocate for orderly systems, clear frameworks, and logical coherence. Cognitively, they create order and seek to eliminate uncertainty, but emotionally, they're unusually calm. They don't get anxious, nor do they get carried away with enthusiasm, and they don't really do urgency or emergency. Their calmness is the result of not being easily annoyed or irritated, not easily angered, not aroused to retaliation, not excitable, not letting little things get to them, not bearing grudges, and not being emotionally triggered. Further, though, from an emotional point of view, the deliberate risk types are, in fact, risk-taking. Not in the active, daring, conscious sense of heroics and intrepid endeavours, but because they don't feel or experience the same fears and vulnerabilities that more emotional people might. This is risk-taking not because of what they do, but because of what they don't do. Extreme deliberate risk types are not, by their nature, fearful. They don't overreact, never panic. Their emotional risk antennae are dialed down, almost even muted, and they're comparatively unresponsive. So for them, thinking dominates feeling. The closer a person's position on the compass is towards the composed end of this continuum, the less emotional they are. Metaphorically, they would be the last to leave the scene of a disaster, be it a sinking ship or burning building or an erupting volcano. They're going to be the people that are collecting up their belongings, looking just for that treasured photograph, making sure everyone else has already left, and then possibly even popping back in to pick up something they'd forgotten to gather. This is risk-taking by default at the composed end of the continuum. So far, we've mostly been talking about feeling and emotions, but the deliberate risk type at this end of the continuum are also prudent decision makers, and this is about thinking and cognition. In terms of cognition, this is all about the need to make sense of everything, to know exactly what's going on before making any decisions. So cognitively, the deliberate risk type is risk averse. They always want to check things out and try to eliminate uncertainty. So while the heart is almost oblivious to risk, the mind is acutely aware of it, easily disturbed and deeply troubled by any uncertainty. If that combination is difficult to grasp, just think of an air traffic controller, someone who accepts the awesome responsibility of bringing in jumbo jet after jumbo jet, each full of happy families returning from holidays and returning them safely down onto the runway, time after time, day after day. Emotionally, they need to turn the knob down. A capacity to stay very calm and focused is essential for them, but cognitively, they need to turn the knob up to the max, to be on high alert to any uncertainty and every anomaly. These are people who look for logical patterns. They want clarity, to know the reasons, both the how and the why. Clearly, they are aware of danger, insecurity, and loss, but at a logical and cognitive level, not at an emotional level. They're things or events to be avoided, things to keep an eye on, and things to research and read up on. Although, in principle, they're happy to comply with the rulebook, their first priority will be to see that actually it all makes sense, to ensure that everything adds up. Their priority is to address and reduce uncertainty, because it's uncertainty, not fear, that really gets to them, that makes them feel very uncomfortable, and they're reluctant to make any decision without first satisfying themselves about the facts. They're as keen to survive as anyone else, and they're not distracted by woe, overwhelmed by panic, urgency, or anxiety. Their total focus on reason prevents them from getting caught up in transient trends, fashionable views, ways of emotion that impact societies from time to time. The deliberate risk types navigate through the confusion of views and advice and reactions that they observe in those around them. Their criteria for action are logic, reason, and coherence, the need to know. Now, let's look back at the potential influence of this continuum between the excitable risk types and the extreme deliberate risk types. Returning to the heart versus mind differentiation referred to above, the best way to approach reactions in COVID, both ends of this continuum reflect interactions between emotion and cognition, or heart and mind, albeit in very different ways. The heart drives the fear or anxiety response to the threat to physical well-being or loss, or to social acceptability or inclusiveness. Our feelings will respond to, endorse, and possibly amplify all the alarm signals and contribute to the gut feelings of foreboding. Alert to and influenced by the negativity of any media, any pessimistic indicators in the statistics, the nudges and propaganda designed to frighten people into greater cooperation, all of these will contribute to their feelings of anxiety and concern. Although feelings sometimes have an immediacy and an urgency, we suggest that they are more generalized and may often operate more as an evolving background context for events. Thoughts seem more frontline, sharper, and more engaged with developments, and they're continuously adapting to phases and developments. We identify 3 stages in which thoughts or cognitions may trend differently in relation to the pandemic. So in phase 1, initially, excitement aroused by the furore, the buzz and agitation, the scope and scale of media coverage, the debate and the arguments. These seismic disruptions to normal routine may herald the chaos that, to the excitable risk type, may signal opportunity. Creatively, they'll feel part of that debate. They'll have opinions and offer critiques of any actions proposed. Moving then to phase 2, as the pandemic becomes more established, the excitable risk types are alert to policy differences around the globe, the U-turns on masks, the use of respirators, advocacy for alternative medications, conflicting epidemiological recommendations, all underscore the lack of unity in terms of strategy. Such doubts open up the debate, open the door to creativity, and justify other opinions and critiques of proposed actions. Their curiosity and imagination then become enlisted in seeking out contrary information to challenge diktats which now seem arbitrary. Retaliatory systems are also engaged to any perceived threat of COVID-19, to egalitarian principles, or to government officialdom being considered overbearing in its attempts to choreograph the population's movements. Then, phase 3, the monotony of lockdown and repetition would eat away at commitment to rigid compliance. So at this stage, it's more about being averse to boredom and reluctance to commit to blind obedience. There's threat of restriction in terms of coping with consistency and monotony, being at odds with the basic desire for variety, excitement, and stimulation. Excitable risk types will be alarmed at the prospect of restraint, control, and tight regulation. In our own research, excitable risk types were frustrated by the lack of imagination being shown by the authorities. Being creative, impulsive individuals, the slow and uninspired response of the government to COVID got on their nerves. If it were up to them, novel approaches to the issues posed by coronavirus would be implemented, but these alternative ideas may not be thought through fully. We also found that they spent more time contemplating who's to blame for the impact of the virus. Their high score on impulsivity meant they were willing to jump from one idea to the next. This flexibility in their opinions allowed them to contemplate multiple options as for who is to blame for the impact of coronavirus. Moving across the compass then to the deliberate risk types, these individuals would be expected to view the pandemic as a problem to be solved rather than one to be feared. The first reactions to the pandemic would be a "what's going on here" response. They will find their way to the most highly regarded sources of knowledge, to the medical specialists, to journalists and publications that they personally regard as being reliable, well briefed and unbiased. What are the spokespeople saying? What are the epidemiologists saying? And where is their consensus? Where in all the hubbub and background noise is the signal, that beacon that points the way out of all of this? Which voices out there are authentic? Deliberate risk types are confident, calculated, and sure-footed in their decision making. Any aversion to risk will be practical rather than emotional. They have a desire to do things in a balanced, sensible, and systematic way. This risk type is not unnerved by radical or extreme proposals, but they will evaluate them forensically and objectively before making their own decisions. They would expect and welcome guidance from the authorities and be prepared to follow their guidance. So the deliberate risk types don't need to be frightened into compliance, just so long as the demands being made are rational and that they can see the reasoning behind those decisions. This requirement for coherence would be frustrated by the ever-changing micromanagement of the COVID decision makers and the inconsistencies of their policies and pronouncements, as well as their failure to present any realistic calculation of collateral damage into account. For deliberate risk types, their composure will be a really important factor in their dealings with COVID. The influence of their calmness is pervasive, powerful, and at times reassuring to others. However, even though on side with compliance cognitively, emotionally, they're not wired for persistent anxiety. Their thoughts and cognitive preoccupations will always push themselves to the fore. Their calmness, their dialed down, attenuated versions of urgency or alarm, may even mean that they don't need to be reminded. That they do need to be reminded about social distancing. They may be the people that need to be reminded to take a mask with them when they leave the house or the car, or to be reminded about the epidemic restrictions of the day. At the same time, the deliberate risk type will be seriously troubled by all of the uncertainty. The uncertainties that have been amplified by continual changes of policy and regulation, and by the dramatically different interpretations of events. The deliberate risk type needs to know, and their propensity for tracking down the evidence, trying to get to the facts of the matter, will expose them to everything from the nothing at all to worry about here school of thought, right the way through to the no end in sight, prepare for more lockdowns camp. So not much certainty for our deliberate risk types there. So possibly more troubled by the government, authorities, and experts than by the epidemic itself. Cognitively, they're fully COVID alert, but difficult to coerce. They're going to stand firm in their demand for logical explanation and will not be bullied into compliance with incoherent policies. PCL's research mid-epidemic found that at that point, deliberate risk types generally trusted authorities to make decisions with the citizens' best interests at heart. Unsettled by uncertainty, having a trust in authority ensured at least some guiding light through the unknown. This also aligns with their view that the pandemic is something that's there that needs to be solved. They also ensured that policies were enacted, desiring to do things in a planned and systematic way. Being able to follow procedures relieved their discomfort with uncertainty. And we also found that they reported remaining calm when witnessing others disobeying guidelines. This reflects the lack of urgency reported in deliberate risk types. Their unemotional focus on practicalities may unsettle others that are more fearful than they are themselves. This brings us to the end of the 4 Pandemics series. Now, you may be one of the many people that have already completed the risk type compass and discovered their risk type, but if not, and if you would also like to know your risk type, you can take the assessment for free by getting in touch with us and just asking for the 4 Pandemics offer. If you take the assessment, you'll receive a complimentary 1-page report. This 1-page report briefly outlines your risk type, and if you then decide that you want to know more about your risk personality, you can upgrade your report to the full report, which includes upsides and downsides of your risk type. It also includes a sub-theme analysis and a lot more. Thank you for watching the 4 Pandemics series. We hope you enjoyed the content, and if you want to discuss anything risk type with us further, then please do get in touch.